In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and let's be honest, most other times, women were meant to stay in their lane, docile, demure, since that's the word lately, inferior to the men they were meant to serve. And this woman was more radical and vocal than many of her other contemporaries. She was also more uncompromising. A lot of folks came to call her the people's Joan of Arc. Others chose less flattering terms. But before all that, Mary Elizabeth Lease was born in Pennsylvania in 1850. Her parents were Irish immigrants. They taught her from early on to stand up for the underdog and against corruption. Unfortunately, she lost her dad and two brothers to the Civil War and blamed the politicians who'd decided it should be fought. Yeah, fucking duh. But when she was 16, she graduated with a teaching certificate and took a position with a local school. But teachers' salaries were painfully low, and women teachers were paid significantly less than men teachers. That's totally different now, right? She heard teachers' wages were slightly higher on the frontier, so she took a position in Osage Mission, Kansas. While there, she met and married Charles Lease. They had 6 kids, 2 of which did not survive childhood. He was a pharmacist who apparently wanted to try other careers. So not long after they were married, they went on to Wichita and bought a farm, which they lost 2 years later in the Panic of 1873. That was an economic crisis triggered by a big business going bankrupt. Anyone who wasn't rich suffered. She said it was no longer a nation for and by the people, but instead for and by Wall Street. Another one that's totally different today, right? Over a period of about 2 decades, unemployment rose to 14%. Prices skyrocketed. Farmers were paid less and less for their crops. Fat cats got fatter on the backs of the poor, and high interest rates. The poor became poorer, and those in power blamed them for it. So the family moved to Denison, Texas, where Charles took a position as a pharmacy clerk. Mary took in washing to make extra money. Well, and she multitasked. So anytime she had extra money, she bought books. If there wasn't extra, she borrowed the books. Then she'd copy pages and pin them up on the wall in front of her washing tub. Folks got clean undies. She got an education. So in 1883, the family was back in Wichita. Farmers were still suffering, and she knew exactly what they were going through. She blamed the major political parties for causing it. You know, choosing corruption and rich donors over their constituents or their oath of office. Again, totally different now. Anyway, remember the washtub education? Yeah, so in 1885, she became one of the first women admitted to the Kansas bar, and she was an attorney. On to the 1890s, and people had had enough. So entered the Populist or People's Party. They wanted political and economic reform. Fucking duh. They wanted farmers and workers' empowerment, and women wanted equality. So back then there was the Knights of Labor. It was a national organization. They were advocating for the 8-hour workday, a graduated federal income tax, and women's right to vote. They encouraged women to join local assemblies. She later said she was proud to be a member because it was the first organization that recognized women as human beings. The People's Party wanted very similar things, like the government helping the little people keep small business afloat, instead of allowing just a few companies to rule the entire market. I know, another one that's completely different today. And so Mary entered the political arena in support of that party. She started local, a lecture tour of Kansas, stumping the trail for populist candidates. A newspaper famously reported that she had told farmers, raise less corn and more hell. Except she didn't actually say that, though she did agree that it was a good idea. She encouraged people to channel their rage for concrete action against government corruption. Folks said she, quote, delivered her message in the way of a 19th century minister. Her rallies resembled antebellum religious revivals. She was fiery, uncompromising. But if you asked men, and nobody had, she was radical, irrational, the typical woman, because she was a smart woman calling out stupid shit. So they had to insult that. Now, at the same time, the women's movement was gaining steam. If you haven't heard, part of the focus was women's right to vote. So she used her platform to drum up support. She once said, the vote commands respect. As such, women's wants will not be treated with contempt as they are today. Yeah, totally different now. But in just a couple of years, she gave more than 160 speeches countrywide. Oh, you know how else she pissed off people? She believed that African Americans were people and advocated for them to have equal rights as well. Yeah, so a woman lecturing, supporting people of color, and not apologizing for any of it. Well, they couldn't have other women getting ideas like that. So a lot of journalists of the masculine persuasion expressed men's deep dissatisfaction. But instead of attacking her policy or anything of substance, they focused on her gender and her looks. I know, you're surprised. One reporter warned women doing that meant their bodies would completely change. I mean, for example, Mary was too tall. She wore only her trademark black dress, which gave her zero sex appeal. Zero. Oh, boo-hoo. She was hideously ugly, with the nose of an anteater. Her lips had gotten thin because she talked too much. Her hands were thin and bony because she gestured too much and used a gavel too much. Her voice was too deep for a woman, and she spoke too much like a man. In other words, she wasn't shutting up. So, if you thought slept her way to the top was new, you're fucking wrong. To paraphrase, critics said that virtuous women who followed her would find themselves like her, doing nothing more than kneeling on the floor in front of the man who could promote them to the next office. And if men supported her, they would become women. Sound fucking familiar? They called her a man-woman, a poor wife and mother. Her husband was the actual woman in their relationship, because he willingly stayed home and took care of the kids because he believed in her work. Heaven forbid. Moving the fuck on. Her supporters turned the insults to her advantage. She was masculine when she had to be, but always a woman. She wasn't a fucking harpy. She was an attorney, and always a woman. She said, where women are excluded is not a fit place for human beings. Yeah, fucking duh. But to take the sting out of her words a little bit, she drove home her support for women's roles as wife and mother, but still insisted that women should have the right to be actively involved in policy instead of passively allowing their husbands to make their decisions for them. The People's Party encouraged her to run for office on their ticket. Local, national, they didn't care. They wanted her in office. So, of course, more masculine criticism. So one of them said women's nervous systems weren't capable of thinking beyond housework. Oh, and this one too. Reporters claimed that she had developed rheumatism because she hadn't stuck to housekeeping. Yeah, that's totally a correlation. So she didn't run for office. In fact, at one point, she specifically requested to have her name blocked from the ballot. She knew if she was nominated, it would split the party. But that didn't keep Governor Llewellyn from appointing her as the head of the State Board of Charities and Corrections. That made her the first woman in the United States to hold such a position. He later unsuccessfully tried to remove her from office because they have this little disagreement. He was on the side of the Populists merging with one of the major political parties, which she knew would destroy the People's Party because they wanted votes. So she left the party. But during her time with the party, she did campaign for two presidential candidates, once in 1892 and once in 1896. Of course, neither of them was elected as president. She became the first editor of a Wichita newspaper called The Independent, and she worked for Joseph Pulitzer in New York. Yeah, the guy that's on that award. And in January of 1886, she put an ad in a Wichita newspaper. She was calling for women who were interested in education, especially for women. 7 answered her call, and the Hypatia Club of Kansas was formed. Their focus was education, culture, and women's rights. She also joined the Bull Moose campaign. They helped nominate Teddy Roosevelt. Along the way, her marriage did end in divorce, and the People's Party did not last long. They blamed her because she was unwilling to bend to societal pressure and team up with corruption. After she moved to New York, where sources said she opened a legal practice to help specifically women and never charged them. Mary Elizabeth Lease passed away in 1933 after blazing a trail of women's empowerment through history. But I find her a little problematic. She defended herself by highlighting women's role as wife and mother. It was the pinnacle of womanhood. She once said that she despised childless women, completely proliferating Victorian beliefs and contradicting what she wanted to do. But was it a problem or politics? Considering contemporary society and guys getting butt hurt, she couldn't completely abandon societal norms. People might turn away from the movement if she did. To some, she would bring about the end of natural womanhood and of the family. She was the scapegoat for a failed political party. But as one author said, she asked no special privilege because she was a woman. She played a man's game in a man's world by men's rules, and won.